The fog was thick and heavy by the time I crossed the Bay Bridge back into San Francisco. The city lights bled into the gray mist, offering a cold comfort after the suffocating heat of my parents' dining room. I did not turn on the radio. The only sound was the hum of my tires against the damp asphalt. I needed the silence to process the sheer audacity of what my father had just claimed. He said I was the financial guarantor for a commercial lease I had never seen, for a business I had explicitly advised against. I parked in the secure garage under my apartment building, my hands gripping the steering wheel long after the engine was off. I barely slept. I lay awake watching the shadows shift across my ceiling, running through the logistical requirements of a commercial real estate contract. You cannot simply write a relative's name on a dotted line and walk away with the keys to a premium downtown storefront. Landlords run comprehensive background checks. They require detailed financial disclosures, tax returns, and government-issued identification. They demand legal verification. I knew this because verifying these exact parameters is how I earn my living. The sun came up filtering through the blinds in pale, unenthusiastic strips. I abandoned the attempt at sleep and walked into my kitchen. I ground the coffee beans, the sharp noise grinding against my fraying nerves. I carried my mug to the small desk in the corner of my living room and opened my laptop. My hands hovered over my mechanical keyboard. The rhythmic clicking sound echoed in my quiet apartment as I typed in my passwords. I log into these credit monitoring portals every single month. It is a habit ingrained in me from years of working in commercial risk. I evaluate corporate vulnerabilities for a living. I audit shell companies, verify asset backing, and flag suspicious financial behavior before millions of dollars change hands. I am paid to be paranoid. I have secondary authentication on every bank account, complex passwords changed quarterly, and a permanent lock on my credit file. The dark irony sat heavy in my chest. I spent my days building impenetrable security walls to protect corporate clients, while my own family simply walked through the back door of my personal life using the social security number printed on my childhood tax returns. The dashboard loaded. I stared at the screen, the breath catching in my throat. The damage was not a threat or a hypothetical scenario. It was a tangible, glaring reality actively destroying my financial standing. My credit score, a number I had meticulously maintained in the high 700s since college, had plummeted. I registered a 110-point drop. A bright red alert flashed across the top of the interface. It cited a severe delinquency and a commercial debt collection flagged on my previously spotless account. The collection agency listed the original creditor as a commercial property management group based in Sacramento. The outstanding balance was precisely $312,000. Panic is a useless emotion in my line of work. When the numbers do not make sense, you do not panic. You audit. I picked up my phone and searched for the property management group's corporate office. I waited until exactly 9 in the morning and dialed their main number. A receptionist answered. I did not sound like a terrified daughter. I employed my professional underwriter voice, the one I use when demanding missing tax schedules from uncooperative corporate clients. I stated my name, provided the address of my sister's failed skincare boutique, and requested a digital copy of the original lease agreement for my personal records. The clerk placed me on a brief hold. Soft, generic jazz played through the speaker, a surreal soundtrack to the dismantling of my life. When the clerk returned, she verified my email address and promised to send the file immediately. 3 minutes later, a notification pinged on my screen. The email contained a 60-page portable document format attachment. I opened the file. It was a standard, rigorous commercial lease agreement for a high-traffic retail space. I skimmed past the zoning disclosures, the tenant improvement allowances, and the hazard insurance requirements. I knew what I was looking for. I scrolled to the final page. Page 58, the guarantor signature block. There it was, my name printed neatly on the primary line. Below it was the signature. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes tracing the digital ink. It was an exceptionally good forgery. It captured the specific upward slant of my capital letters, the slight hesitation in the loop of my final consonant. Someone had practiced this. Someone had taken the time to study my handwriting, likely using old birthday cards or university loan documents my parents kept in their home office. But the signature was not the most devastating part of the page. My eyes drifted to the bottom right corner. Stamped in clear, official blue ink was a California notary public seal. It contained a commission number, an expiration date, and the signature of the sworn officer who authorized it. The room seemed to drop in temperature. A forged signature is a desperate lie. A notary stamp elevates that lie to a coordinated crime. A notary is an agent of the state. Their sole legal function is to physically witness a signature, verify the identity of the signer using a government-issued credential, and swear under penalty of perjury that the person in the room is exactly who they claim to be. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a careless mistake made by a desperate father trying to keep his favorite daughter's business open for one more month. This was a calculated, multi-tiered felony. To secure this lease, my parents had to present someone claiming to be me. They had to provide identification bearing my name. They had to find a notary willing to either turn a blind eye to a fake driver license or knowingly participate in the fraud. I printed the document. The printer hummed, spitting out the pages that tied my financial identity to an anchor. I arranged the signature page on my desk, placing it next to my coffee mug. I stared at the notary stamp again. The name on the seal was Dennis Walsh. The name felt familiar, an echo from summer barbecues and country club guest lists. My parents had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had weaponized the legal system to fund Harper. They were perfectly willing to let a collection agency destroy my career in the financial sector just to spare my sister the embarrassment of a public failure. For 2 years, Harper played the successful entrepreneur. For 2 years, my parents smiled and bragged about her boutique at social gatherings, hiding the reality that the business was bleeding money. When their own retirement funds dried up, they did not force her to close. They looked north to San Francisco, saw the safety net I had spent a decade building, and decided it belonged to them. I picked up my phone. It showed 4 new text messages from my mother, each one escalating in guilt and pressure. She asked how I could abandon my sister. She told me to call my father immediately to arrange the asset transfer. They still thought they were in control. They still believed the dynamic of our childhood would hold, that the responsible older sister would eventually capitulate to save the golden child. They had no idea I was looking at state evidence. My mother and father always operated on a dual ledger. They applied 2 entirely different accounting systems to their children. One column belonged to me, a strict ledger of high expectations and rigid self-reliance. The other column belonged to Harper, an open-ended account characterized by endless grace and financial padding. Growing up, the disparity was not a hidden secret. It was an established rule of our household. I learned the value of $1 by understanding the labor required to earn it. I paid my own tuition at the University of California, Berkeley. I worked double shifts at a local cafe while attending full-time classes. I shared a cramped apartment far from campus to save on rent. I scrutinized every grocery receipt and bypassed social events to review macroeconomic textbooks. I calculated the exact return on investment for my degree. I graduated with honors, secured my underwriting position, and built an impenetrable safety net through sheer endurance. My success was expected, therefore it was rarely celebrated. My sister experienced a very different reality. On her 18th birthday, my father tossed her the keys to a pristine luxury sport utility vehicle. It featured heated leather seats and a premium sound system. She dented the front fender within a week. My father paid for the repair without a single lecture about responsibility. She never held a summer job. She never balanced a checking account. She floated through early adulthood on a cushion of parental subsidies. When she decided she wanted to be an entrepreneur, my parents did not ask to see a business plan. They simply asked how much she needed. 2 years ago, my father proudly announced Harper's new venture. He called it an investment in her vision. He provided the seed capital to secure the downtown Sacramento storefront. The boutique was designed to project an image of effortless wealth. The shelves held imported botanical serums and rare clay exfoliants. But retail is an unforgiving environment. I knew the demographics of that specific commercial district. I knew the foot traffic would never generate enough volume to support her staggering overhead costs. I attended the launch party for the boutique. The storefront was decorated with elaborate floral arrangements. Soft lighting illuminated the pristine glass displays. My father stood in the center of the room, holding a glass of expensive champagne. He offered a booming toast to Harper's entrepreneurial spirit. He called her a visionary and praised her tireless work ethic. The room applauded. 10 minutes later, the head caterer pulled me aside into a narrow back hallway. He wore a crisp black vest and looked incredibly uncomfortable. He held a wireless payment terminal in his hand. He informed me that Harper's credit card had declined for the final catering balance. I peered around the corner. My sister was busy posing for photographs with her friends, holding up a glass of sparkling water. My father was busy shaking hands and accepting congratulations. Neither of them noticed the vendor waiting to be paid. I reached into my purse, pulled out my own debit card, and settled the catering invoice. I did it to avoid a public scene. That event encapsulated our entire family dynamic. My sister received the applause and I quietly covered the deficit. That was day one. The failure of the storefront began before the doors even opened to the public. The ultimate collapse of the enterprise was not a sudden tragedy caused by shifting market trends. It was a slow, agonizing hemorrhage of capital over 24 months. Harper signed binding vendor contracts for exclusive product lines she could not sell. She missed her first rent payment by month 4. My mother and father stepped in quietly behind the scenes. They viewed her failure as a temporary setback rather than a fatal business flaw. They believed throwing more money at the problem would eventually fix it. They liquidated their mutual funds. They drained their hard-earned retirement accounts to placate her commercial landlord. They sacrificed their own financial security to sustain a retail fantasy. When their own liquidity dried up, they faced a critical choice. They could force Harper to close the store, declare bankruptcy, and face the humiliation of a failed venture. Or they could find a new source of capital. They refused to let their favored daughter experience consequences. Instead, they looked 2 hours south to San Francisco. They observed the stable life I had built. They saw my pristine credit history, my steady income, and my diverse stock portfolio. They did not view my stability as something I earned. They viewed it as an untapped resource waiting to be harvested for Harper's benefit. They did not just throw a life preserver to a drowning business. They actively cannibalized my financial future to hide her incompetence. In their minds, my money belonged to the collective bloodline. They stole my identity because they valued her comfort over my survival. I sat at my desk and looked at the forged signature on the digital document. The calculated nature of the crime crystallized in my mind. They needed a guarantor to renew the commercial lease and restructure the mounting debt. They knew I would never agree to sign the paperwork, so they removed my agency entirely. They orchestrated a fraud, utilizing a corrupt notary to bind me to a sinking ship. They expected me to discover the debt only when it was too late. They assumed I would fall in line just like I did in that back hallway with the caterer. They gambled my entire career on the premise that I would protect the family name. I picked up my phone. The screen displayed 5 new text messages from my mother. She demanded an answer. She told me I was being selfish. She reminded me of everything they had done for me during my childhood. It was a pathetic attempt to use guilt as leverage. I placed the device face down on my desk. I opened a new secure browser window. I did not shed a single tear over the betrayal. I engaged the exact protocols I use when a corporate client exhibits signs of severe financial malfeasance. I initiated a hard freeze on my Social Security number across all 3 major credit bureaus. I submitted an official dispute regarding the commercial debt collection, flagging the account as fraudulent. I began drafting a timeline of my whereabouts on the date the document was notarized. I took the first definitive steps to dismantle their illegal safety net. When my parents realized their text messages were going unanswered, they understood their private intimidation tactics were failing. I was not folding under the pressure of a quiet family dinner. I was locking the gates. The silence from Sacramento did not last long. My mother and father realized they could not control me directly anymore. They needed to force my compliance through external pressure. They prepared to change their strategy. The private demands were over. It was time for them to recruit allies. The psychological warfare was about to bleed into the public sphere. I submitted the formal dispute paperwork to the credit bureaus early on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, my parents realized their backdoor access to my financial life was permanently sealed. The collection agency notified them that the guarantor account was officially contested under claims of identity theft. My father lost his invisible leverage. He could no longer quietly siphon my assets from afar. Since he failed to extract the capital through a secret legal maneuver, he shifted his strategy toward absolute public coercion. Susan fired the opening salvo on the internet. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a logistics portfolio when my computer monitor illuminated with a notification. It was a message from a former college roommate checking in on me, attaching a screenshot for context. My mother had published a status update on her main profile page. She did not mention the commercial lease. She did not reference the $300,000 deficit. Instead, she crafted a masterpiece of vague emotional manipulation. The text lamented the heartbreak of a selfish child. It described a daughter's cruel abandonment during a season of unimaginable hardship. She claimed she and Richard were facing imminent bankruptcy because their eldest offspring turned her back on unconditional loyalty. Susan possessed a specific talent for playing the martyr. During my youth, if I refused to surrender my allowance to buy Harper a trivial item, my mother would weep quietly in the kitchen until I handed over the cash just to stop the theatrical performance. This digital display was an amplified version of that exact tactic. The post garnered dozens of sympathetic reactions within a single hour. Neighbors, church acquaintances, and distant relatives flooded the comment section offering prayers and expressing deep shock at my alleged cruelty. They devoured the fabricated narrative without asking for a single piece of evidence. My mobile device began vibrating relentlessly against the solid wood of my desk. The alerts stacked up in rapid succession. I watched the screen as a dormant household chat thread reawakened. The sickening chime of a new participant joining the group message echoed in my quiet office space. It was a cousin from Denver, adding his loud voice to the digital firing squad. The incoming texts were vicious. They demanded I apologize to my elders. They ordered me to release the necessary funds to save the household. Then a direct communication thread with my sister surfaced at the top of the display. I stared at the screen. A small gray indicator appeared. Harper was typing. The animated bubble pulsed on the glass for 30 agonizing seconds. I waited for a confession, a sincere apology, or perhaps a tiny shred of genuine remorse. The bubble vanished. Harper deleted whatever she initially intended to say. She chose cowardice over accountability. 10 minutes later, a fresh voicemail arrived. The caller identification displayed Aunt Deborah. She is my father's older sister, a loud woman who thrives on suburban drama and functions as the primary distributor of neighborhood gossip. I pressed play, holding the speaker close to my ear. Her tone dripped with self-righteous venom. She accused me of hoarding my corporate wealth while my own flesh and blood faced total ruin on the streets. She told me I was a severe disgrace to the Butler lineage. She demanded I drive down to Sacramento, immediately beg for immediate forgiveness, and write a massive check to save my parents from absolute destitution. In the commercial underwriting sector, professionals constantly analyze reputational risk. When a corporation faces a severe public relations crisis, the initial instinct is often to issue a frantic emotional denial. Panic leads to reckless public statements. Those premature statements are inevitably twisted by adversaries to inflict maximum damage. The most effective defense against a coordinated smear campaign is absolute silence. You let the attackers exhaust their ammunition. You refuse to provide them with fresh material to twist. I applied this strict corporate doctrine to my own bloodline. I did not type a defensive reply in the group chat. I did not call Aunt Deborah to explain the forged notary stamp. I did not leave a comment on my mother's theatrical social media post defending my character. Any emotional response would only validate their flawed premise. If I argued my case, they would frame my anger as concrete evidence of my inherent cruelty. If I explained the identity theft, they would accuse me of making up wild lies to protect my personal wealth. My silence became my armor. It drove the attackers insane. I turned my ringer off and placed the device deep inside my bottom drawer. The physical separation brought a necessary sliver of mental clarity. They wanted me to feel completely isolated. They wanted the crushing weight of communal disapproval to shatter my boundaries. It is a highly effective psychological weapon. Most normal people will surrender their life savings just to stop the persistent whispers at holiday gatherings. But my family miscalculated my personal tolerance for their disapproval. I had spent my entire existence on the cold periphery of their affection. Being the villain in their story was not a shocking new experience. It was simply a much louder version of my typical childhood. I felt the sharp sting of their collective betrayal, but the pain did not translate into blind compliance. Let me break down this precise anatomy of this specific type of warfare. A smear campaign relies entirely on a massive imbalance of information. Richard and Susan held the megaphone broadcasting their manufactured victimhood to a gullible audience. I held the objective truth locked away securely in a digital evidence folder. By refusing to engage in their mudslinging, I forced them to punch at empty shadows. They escalated their rhetoric over the next 48 hours. Susan posted more frequently, sending increasingly hostile text messages to my silent number. The group chat swelled to 15 angry relatives. The wild accusations grew even more unhinged. Now I was not just hoarding wealth, I was actively trying to destroy my sister's fragile mental health. Their logic rapidly deteriorated as their mounting frustration peaked. I sat alone in my living room that evening, watching the city skyline glow against the dark night sky. My laptop illuminated the dim space. I was methodically documenting every single defamatory text, hostile voicemail, and manipulative social media post. I backed up the audio files to a secure cloud server. I captured high-resolution screenshots of the most damaging comments. I was no longer just a frustrated daughter dealing with toxic parents. I was an active investigator compiling a comprehensive legal dossier. Their public harassment would eventually serve as undeniable evidence of their malicious intent. By Friday afternoon, the digital onslaught began to reach a plateau. My father realized the dramatic internet posts and the angry voicemails from extended relatives were failing to produce the desired wire transfer. My steadfast refusal to argue left him with zero psychological leverage. A rational person would recognize the absolute defeat and order a strategic retreat. But Richard was staring down an impending commercial default with real-world consequences. Desperation breeds spectacular mistakes. Since he could not shame me into submission within the private sphere of our family network, he decided to attack the one remaining place I truly valued. He prepared to cross the ultimate boundary into my professional life. The digital harassment was merely a noisy distraction. The real assault was already in motion, headed straight for my corporate office building. The executive conference room at my firm sits on the 42nd floor overlooking the Transamerica Pyramid. It is a sterile environment designed for high-stakes decisions. The walls are soundproofed glass. The center of the space is dominated by a polished mahogany table that reflects the skyline. Our managing partners are deeply conservative men who value discretion above all else. They manage billions of dollars in commercial real estate portfolios, and their primary mandate is the avoidance of unnecessary drama. In this building, your reputation is your primary currency. If you become a liability, you become unemployed. I stood at the head of the mahogany table on a Thursday morning, concluding a comprehensive risk assessment for a proposed retail development in San Jose. My presentation was flawless. I spent 3 weeks evaluating the local zoning ordinances, the projected foot traffic, and the fiscal stability of the anchor tenants. The senior partners nodded in unison, their tailored wool suits blending into the muted gray upholstery of their ergonomic chairs. I clicked to the final slide highlighting the projected return on investment. The room held a quiet, respectful hum of approval. Then the heavy glass door swung open. It was not the administrative assistant bringing in fresh coffee. The man who walked into our secure executive suite wore a cheap nylon windbreaker and scuffed boots. He carried a battered leather messenger bag across his chest. His presence was a glaring anomaly in a room where even the interns wore custom-tailored dress shirts. The receptionist trailed closely behind him, her face flushed with panic, whispering frantic apologies to the managing director. She explained the intruder bypassed the security desk by tailgating a delivery courier into the private elevator bank. The man ignored her completely. He scanned the faces around the room before locking his eyes directly on me. "Lucy Butler?" he asked. His voice was loud, carrying a coarse edge that shattered the refined quiet of the boardroom. I lowered my laser pointer. "Yes." He reached into his satchel, extracted a thick manila envelope, and tossed it across the polished wood. The heavy thud of the legal package hitting the mahogany conference table echoed like a gunshot. "You have been served," he announced, turning on his heel and walking out just as abruptly as he arrived. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stared at the envelope resting near my presentation notes. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my exterior remained frozen in a posture of professional composure. I did not gasp. I did not stumble. I slowly reached out and pulled the thick paper package toward me. The managing partners shifted uncomfortably in their expensive chairs. They are men trained to spot liability from miles away, and a process server interrupting a closed-door meeting is a giant warning signal. They stared at their digital tablets, studying the grain of the wood, pretending they were not looking. But I saw their eyes darting toward the plaintiff names boldly printed on the top left corner of the return address label. Richard and Susan Butler. My parents had sent a process server to my place of employment. They intentionally breached the walls of my career to deliver their next strike. I offered a brief, flat apology to the room. I stated it was an administrative error regarding a private estate matter, gathered my presentation materials, and exited the conference room with my spine straight. I walked down the long corridor to my private office, closed the door, and engaged the deadbolt. I sat at my desk and tore open the manila flap. Inside lay a formal civil complaint filed in the Superior Court of California. My eyes scanned the dense legal typography. The cause of action was listed as breach of contract. They were actually suing me. The narrative constructed within those stapled pages was a masterclass in gaslighting. According to the sworn declaration signed by my father, I had supposedly made a binding verbal promise to fund my sister's skincare boutique 2 years ago. The document claimed I willingly signed the commercial lease guarantee to secure the retail space for Lumina. It went on to allege that upon learning the business was facing temporary cash flow issues, I spitefully backed out of my financial obligations out of deep-seated sibling rivalry. The complaint demanded I honor the forged guarantee, pay the $300,000 deficit, and cover their mounting attorney fees. They fabricated an entire alternate reality and codified it into a legal filing. They painted me as a wealthy, vindictive professional who lured her family into a financial trap only to abandon them at the critical moment. I read the paragraphs again, letting the sheer audacity of the lies settle into my brain. The tactical brilliance of their maneuver was undeniable. By serving me at my corporate office in front of the senior leadership team, they escalated the stakes from private annoyance to professional peril. They understood the conservative culture of my industry. A commercial risk underwriter cannot possess a public record stained by allegations of broken contracts and financial betrayal. Clients entrust us with their capital based on our flawless integrity. A looming civil trial regarding a staggering debt default would render me radioactive to my employers. Richard and Susan were betting my career on this lawsuit. They assumed the intense humiliation of the process server combined with the threat of losing my lucrative job would force me into a swift, silent capitulation. They expected me to panic, contact their attorney, and offer a quiet settlement just to make the public scandal disappear. They wanted me to pay the ransom to protect my pristine reputation. I set the document down. The pages felt heavy, saturated with my parents' toxic entitlement. They believed they held the ultimate trump card. They thought dragging my name through the mud of the civil justice system would break my resolve. They were wrong. The serving of these papers fundamentally altered the rules of engagement. This was no longer a domestic dispute managed through ignored phone calls and blocked social media accounts. Silence is a highly effective shield against neighborhood gossip, but it is a terrible defense against a formalized lawsuit. If I ignored a court summons, a judge would issue a default judgment in their favor. My wages would be garnished. My bank accounts would be frozen. My hard-earned assets would be legally drained to rescue my sister's failed retail experiment. My father escalated the conflict from an emotional shakedown to a formal legal battle. He threw down a gauntlet forged in perjury. I realized in that quiet office that maintaining the high ground was no longer a viable survival strategy. Playing defense would only prolong the bleeding. To protect my future, I needed to shift into a relentless offense. I needed someone who understood the brutal mechanics of financial litigation. I needed an advocate who did not care about the delicate nuances of family dynamics or the emotional history of my childhood. I required a professional who viewed this fabricated lawsuit for exactly what it was: a calculated crime. I reached for my desktop computer and opened my encrypted contact database. I began searching for the most aggressive corporate litigator in the Bay Area. The time for passive resistance had officially expired. If my parents wanted to utilize the justice system as a weapon, I was going to ensure they experienced the full devastating recoil of their own strategy. I was going to find a shark. The law offices of Rostova and Associates did not feature warm mahogany paneling or plush leather sofas. The reception area was an expansive stretch of polished white marble and frosted glass. It felt less like a place of business and more like a high-end surgical suite. That was precisely why I chose it. I did not need a sympathetic counselor to hold my hand and validate my emotional trauma. I needed a specialist who could surgically extract a toxic element from my life. Elena Rostova walked into the conference room exactly on time. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that mirrored the gray skies over the San Francisco Bay, visible through her floor-to-ceiling windows. She did not offer a warm smile of greeting. She did not ask how I was holding up after being humiliated at my workplace. She simply introduced herself with a firm handshake, sat across the wide table, and opened the manila envelope I had surrendered to her paralegal 10 minutes prior. An assistant entered silently, bringing a tray that held a silver pitcher of water and a single tall glass of iced coffee. Elena reached for the beverage. Before taking a sip, she meticulously slid a square slate coaster perfectly under the sweating base, ensuring not a single drop of condensation touched the pristine surface of the conference table. Her movements were deliberate, economical, and highly practiced. She applied that exact same clinical precision to the legal documents spread before her. Elena read the civil complaint in silence. She traced the lines of the fabricated narrative my father had sworn under oath. She studied the forged commercial lease guarantee, running a manicured finger over the copied ink. The soundproofed walls of her office absorbed the chaotic city noise outside, creating a heavy, sterile vacuum. In this isolated environment, the reality of my family drama stripped away its domestic disguise. It no longer felt like a bitter argument over a dining room table. Sitting under the harsh modern lighting of a corporate litigation firm, the actions of my parents suddenly felt dangerously criminal. Elena set the papers down and folded her hands. "This is a highly calculated strategy," she stated, her voice devoid of any comforting inflection. "They are banking entirely on your professional vulnerability. They understand that a commercial underwriter cannot survive a protracted civil trial regarding a defaulted retail lease. They are attempting to force a rapid settlement by threatening your primary source of income." I nodded, keeping my posture rigid. I refused to pay a settlement for a document I never signed. Elena leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto mine. Forgery is a common byproduct of desperate financial situations. People sign their spouses' names on automotive loan applications or endorse checks that do not belong to them. But commercial leases require a much higher threshold of verification. They require an authorized agent of the state to verify the identity of the signatory. She tapped her index finger against the blue seal stamped at the bottom of the final page. The weak link in any forged notarized document is always the notary public. They either failed to properly check a government identification card, or they were an active, willing participant in the fraud. Elena rotated the page toward me. Do you recognize the name Dennis Walsh? I stared at the cursive signature scrawled across the California state seal. A cold wave of clarity washed over me. I did not just recognize the name, I knew the man. Dennis Walsh was a local real estate broker operating in the Sacramento suburbs. More importantly, he was my father's longtime golf partner. They spent countless Sunday mornings walking the greens at the municipal course, drinking cheap beer and exchanging casual favors. He is a friend of my father, I replied, my voice steady. He sells suburban ranch homes. They play golf together every single weekend. Elena sat back in her chair. The corners of her mouth twitched upward into a cold, predatory approximation of a smile. That is the specific detail that elevates the situation from a panicked family mistake to a coordinated criminal conspiracy. Your parents did not just walk into a random bank branch and fool a stranger behind a desk. They brought an insider into the fold. They convinced a licensed real estate professional to risk his state credentials to authenticate a phantom signature. Elena proceeded to outline the brutal arithmetic of the legal battlefield. She offered zero comforting platitudes. She explained the stakes with the detached efficiency of a military tactician. If we lose this civil case, the judge will enforce the guarantee. Your wages will be garnished for the next decade to satisfy the $300,000 deficit, plus compounding interest and the opposing attorney fees. Your bank accounts will be levied. Your career in the financial sector will evaporate overnight. No reputable firm employs an underwriter with a court-mandated judgment for commercial contract evasion on their public record. She paused, letting the heavy reality of a ruined life settle in the sterile room. However, Elena continued, her tone sharpening, if we successfully prove this document is a forgery, the pendulum swings with devastating momentum in the opposite direction. We will not merely request a standard case dismissal. We will file a countersuit for malicious prosecution. Furthermore, I will personally refer the compiled evidence to the district attorney. Your father and your sister will face felony charges for perjury and uttering a forged instrument. Dennis Walsh will lose his broker license and face state prison time for notary fraud. She leaned across the table. If we proceed down this path, your parents will likely face formal incarceration. Your sister's life will be permanently derailed. I need to know right now if you possess the stomach for that outcome. Many clients initiate this process fueled by righteous anger only to fold at the last minute when they realize their own blood relatives might be handcuffed in a courtroom. If you are going to waver, tell me now so we can draft a quiet settlement offer. I looked at the forged signature on the table. I thought about my father sending a process server to humiliate me in front of my managing partners. I thought about the decades of watching my parents prioritize Harper's endless comfort over my basic survival. The anxiety that had plagued me for days evaporated, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. I shifted my stance from a hunted victim to an active combatant. I am not settling, I said. Burn their case to the ground. Elena nodded, a genuine spark of approval lighting her features. Excellent. Then we established the ground rules immediately. Effective this second, you are under a strict no-contact directive. You will not answer phone calls from your parents. You will not respond to text messages from your sister. You will not engage with angry aunts or cousins on the internet. If they show up at your apartment building, you will not open the door. You will call the authorities and report a trespasser. She was turning my emotional pain into a calculated legal counteroffensive. Every time they reach out to you, they are fishing for information. They are looking for a weakness or an emotional outburst they can present to the judge to paint you as unstable and vindictive. You will give them nothing. Let them sit in the dark and wonder what you are planning. Let their attorney believe they hold the upper hand. Arrogance leads to sloppy, irreversible mistakes. Elena gathered the paperwork and slid the documents into a secure blue folder. To destroy their narrative, we do not need to argue about family dynamics or sibling rivalry in front of a judge. We only need to break the physical logistics of their lie. She opened the folder one last time and pointed a slender pen at the handwritten date inscribed beside the notary stamp. October 14th of last year. Dennis Walsh swore under oath that you sat in his Sacramento office on that specific afternoon and signed away your financial freedom. Elena closed the folder with a sharp snap. I need you to go home, open your digital archives, and find out exactly where you were on October 14th. If you can provide documented proof that you were not in that room, their entire house of cards collapses. The commute back to my apartment felt entirely different than the drive the night before. The crushing weight of the morning had evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating energy. I unlocked my front door, bypassed the kitchen, and walked directly to the small alcove serving as my home office. I placed my briefcase on the floor and booted up my primary workstation. Elena had given me a single specific objective. I needed to map my exact coordinates on a random Tuesday in the middle of last autumn, October 14th. I sat in my ergonomic chair and stared at the glowing monitor. For an ordinary person, reconstructing a single afternoon from a year ago is a difficult task. Memory fades. Days blend together in a fog of routine commutes and mundane errands. But I do not rely on memory. I rely on ledgers. As a professional risk assessor, I document my existence with the same rigorous precision I apply to corporate audits. My digital calendar is a minute-by-minute architecture of my life. I opened my cloud storage drive. I navigated to the archived folders for the previous fiscal year, filtered the calendar application to October, and selected the second week. The grid populated on my screen. I traced my index finger down the column for the 14th. A solid block of navy blue filled the entire day, extending through the weekend. The text inside the block read, National Commercial Underwriting Symposium. The location was Chicago, Illinois. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer to the high-resolution display, reading the itinerary notes I had typed 12 months prior. My parents had selected a random weekday to execute their fraud. They likely assumed I was sitting at my desk in the financial district 90 miles away from their Sacramento suburb. They figured my routine was predictable. They never bothered to verify my corporate travel schedule because they never actually took an interest in my professional life. Their profound indifference toward my career resulted in a fatal logistical error. I needed more than a digital calendar entry to satisfy a judge. I needed undeniable documented proof of my physical location. I pushed my chair back and walked to my bedroom closet. On the top shelf, tucked behind winter coats, sat a heavy leather travel portfolio I use exclusively for business trips. I pulled it down and brought it to the living room rug. I unzipped the main compartment. Inside, neatly filed in chronological order, were the physical remnants of my corporate excursions. I flipped through the thick stock paper dividers until I reached the autumn section. My fingers brushed against a thin rectangular slip of cardstock. I pulled it out into the light. It was a crinkled, slightly faded Delta Airlines boarding pass. The departure origin was San Francisco International Airport. The destination was Chicago, O'Hare. The departure date was October 13th, the evening before Dennis Walsh claimed I sat in his real estate office. The return flight was booked for October 17th. My name was printed across the top in crisp black ink, right above the scannable barcode. This piece of paper was a geographic alibi. But in the realm of high-stakes litigation, one layer of proof is merely a foundation. I needed to build an impenetrable fortress. I returned to my computer workstation and logged into my corporate expense account. I searched the transaction history for the middle of October. The query returned a list of itemized charges. I located the entry for the Palmer House Hilton in downtown Chicago. I navigated to the billing portal, entered my confirmation sequence, and hit download. The triumphant click of my mouse echoed in the quiet room as the hotel folio rendered on my screen. It was a detailed invoice covering 4 nights. It included a room service charge for a club sandwich ordered at 1 p.m. on October 14th. The receipt proved I was physically occupying a hotel room in the Midwest, while my father and his golf partner were busy forging my signature on the West Coast. I did not stop there. I needed to establish my exact whereabouts down to the hour. The underwriting symposium required attendees to wear radio frequency identification badges. Every time a participant entered a seminar hall, the security scanners logged their specific credential. I accessed the convention organizer's online portal. I submitted a formal data request for my attendance record. Because I held an active membership with the Guild, the automated system processed my inquiry instantly. A spreadsheet materialized in my Downloads folder. It contained a chronological list of time-stamped badge swipes. On October 14th at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, Pacific Standard Time, my badge was scanned entering a lecture hall on the ground floor of the Chicago Convention Center for a seminar on regulatory compliance. I sat back and stared at the trinity of evidence displayed across my dual monitors. The airline boarding pass, the hotel room service receipt, the digital convention timestamp. It is physically impossible for a human being to exist in two places at once. I could not be swiping into a continuing education seminar near Lake Michigan while simultaneously sitting in a suburban California real estate office, pressing a pen to a commercial lease guarantee. The distance between those 2 points is over 2,000 miles. My parents had built an elaborate suffocating trap using perjury and stolen identity, but they built it on a day I was not even in the state. This was not just a piece of favorable evidence. This was the smoking gun. I picked up my mobile device and dialed Elena. She answered on the second ring, her tone clipped and professional. "I have the timeline I stated." "Tell me," she replied. I walked her through the discoveries. I detailed the flight manifests, the room service receipt, and the radio frequency badge scans. I read the precise hours and minutes corresponding to each transaction. I kept my voice devoid of emotion, delivering the facts with the clinical detachment she preferred. When I finished, a long silence hung on the line. For a brief second, I wondered if the documentation was insufficient. Then I heard a soft, unmistakable sound. Elena Rostova smiled. It was evident in her voice, a sharp, calculating sound of pure tactical supremacy. "Pack those files into an encrypted folder and transmit them to my secure server immediately," she ordered. "You have handed us the exact weapon we need to dismantle their entire lawsuit." "Do we file a motion to dismiss right now?" I asked, eager to end the looming threat to my career. "No," Elena replied, her voice hardening into a razor edge. "If we reveal this geographic impossibility during the preliminary discovery phase, their attorney will scramble. He will invent a procedural excuse. He will claim the date was a clerical error or a simple typo made by the notary. They will try to amend the complaint and change the narrative to protect themselves from criminal liability." She paused, letting the strategy solidify. "We are going to keep this evidence hidden deep in our pockets," she continued. "We are going to let them walk into a sworn deposition. We will let them march into a formal courtroom. We will encourage them to swear under oath repeatedly and definitively that October 14th was the exact day you sat in that room. We will let them lock themselves inside a burning building of their own design. And then only when they cannot escape, we will show the judge the flight records." I agreed to the strategy. I ended the call and transmitted the encrypted files. I felt a profound sense of relief washing over my tired muscles. The shadow of the lawsuit no longer terrified me. It empowered me. I possessed the key to my own exoneration. But surviving a toxic family is rarely a straightforward path. The moment you secure one flank, the adversary probes another. My parents must have sensed the shifting momentum. My continued silence and my failure to beg for a settlement likely triggered alarms in Sacramento. Since the legal intimidation failed to produce an immediate surrender, they decided to deploy their most deceptive weapon. My phone vibrated on the desk. The caller identification displayed a restricted number, but the subsequent text message slipped through my digital block. It was an incoming location pin, followed by a short, desperate plea. Harper was no longer hiding behind our parents. She was stepping directly into the line of fire, preparing to execute a maneuver designed to trap me using the one vulnerability I had yet to armor: my sense of sibling guilt. Saturday mornings in San Francisco usually provide a predictable rhythm. The marine layer rolls off the bay, wrapping the city in a dense gray fog, and the local cafes fill with quiet patrons seeking refuge from the damp chill. I maintain a strict weekend routine to decompress from my high-pressure corporate job. I walked 3 blocks from my apartment building to a small independent coffee shop I have frequented for 4 years. It is a narrow space with exposed brick walls and reclaimed wood tables. It serves as my sanctuary away from spreadsheets and risk assessment models. I ordered my standard black coffee, claimed my preferred corner booth, and opened my laptop to organize the encrypted files Elena requested. The small bell above the front door chimed. I did not look up immediately. My attention was focused on categorizing the digital hotel receipts from my Chicago business trip. Then a familiar shadow fell across my keyboard. I raised my eyes. Harper was standing next to my table. Her appearance was a carefully orchestrated performance. My sister typically curates her aesthetic with relentless perfection, favoring tailored blazers and expensive salon blowouts. Today she wore an oversized gray sweater that swallowed her frame. Her hair was pulled into a messy knot, and she lacked her usual pristine makeup. She looked deliberately fragile, projecting the image of a terrified, overwhelmed younger sibling standing on the brink of total collapse. She knew my weekend routine from the rare occasions she visited me in the city back before her retail venture consumed our family dynamics. She did not ask for permission to join me. She simply pulled out the opposing metal chair and sat down. I closed my laptop monitor, letting the screen click shut. I did not offer a greeting. I waited in total silence, observing her behavior with the same detached scrutiny I applied to a fraudulent insurance claim. Harper reached into her designer tote bag and extracted a large iced latte she must have purchased from a chain franchise down the street. She placed the clear plastic cup on the wooden table between us. She then pulled out her mobile device and placed it flat on the surface, keeping the dark screen facing the ceiling. "I cannot do this anymore, Lucy," she whispered, her voice trembling. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I watched a thick bead of condensation form near the rim of her plastic cup. Gravity pulled the water droplet down the side, leaving a wet trail before pooling on the varnished wood. Harper did not touch the beverage. She did not take a single sip. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and buried her face in her hands. The tears began to fall. She told me the civil lawsuit was tearing her apart from the inside. She claimed she could not sleep, could not eat, and could not function under the crushing weight of the legal threats. She painted a picture of absolute domestic misery, stating our father was out of control and the lawyers were terrifying her with talks of asset seizures and permanent bankruptcy. "You have to make it stop," she pleaded, looking up with red, watery eyes. "You have the power to fix this. Please just sign a settlement agreement so our family can heal." I listened to the cadence of her speech. Something felt fundamentally wrong. When people are genuinely experiencing a panic attack, their language becomes fragmented. They repeat themselves. They lose their train of thought. Harper's delivery was entirely too smooth. Her vocabulary was specific, calculated, and distinctly legal. She reached across the table, hovering her hand inches from mine. "I know Dad went too far with the lawsuit," she continued, her tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But if you just admit we had a prior discussion about you helping the business, his attorney can draft a simple payment plan. You do not even have to pay the whole amount. Just acknowledge you offered verbal support last year and the formal lawsuit goes away forever. We can go back to being sisters." The puzzle pieces clicked together with sharp precision. My training as a risk underwriter requires me to identify hidden liabilities. I scan environments for the details that do not belong. I shifted my gaze away from her weeping eyes and looked down at the table. I focused on her mobile device resting near the sweating iced latte. Harper utilized a sheer translucent silicone case to protect her hardware. Through the clear rubber edge facing my direction, a tiny distinct red indicator light pulsed with rhythmic consistency. She was actively recording our conversation. The realization hit me like a physical blow, followed immediately by a wave of cold, crystalline clarity. Harper was not an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire of our parents' desperate financial scheme. She was an active, willing conspirator. She drove 2 hours to my neighborhood on a Saturday morning to execute an intelligence gathering mission. My father's attorney knew their forged commercial guarantee was a massive vulnerability. To fortify their civil complaint, they needed supplemental evidence. They needed a recorded admission of a verbal contract. They sent my sister to ambush me in a public setting, hoping my familial guilt would provoke me into saying something compromising. They wanted me to express pity, apologize for the situation, or acknowledge a prior financial discussion. Any vague statement of sympathy would be twisted by their legal counsel to prove I had an oral agreement to fund the skincare boutique. California mandates two-party consent for audio recordings. Capturing a private conversation without explicit permission from all involved individuals is a strict violation of the law. Harper was committing a crime in real time, sitting across from me, shedding manufactured tears to mask her espionage. The final lingering shred of my sisterly affection died in that coffee shop. The woman sitting opposite me was no longer family. She was a liability trying to destroy my future. I did not confront her about the blinking red light. Revealing my awareness would only educate the enemy. If I exposed the wiretap, she would simply delete the file and try a different manipulation tactic later. Instead, I decided to give her exactly what she needed to capture on her audio file, delivering a statement so legally bulletproof it would render her recording utterly useless to her attorney. I sat up perfectly straight, aligning my posture. I locked my eyes onto hers, stripping every ounce of warmth or hesitation from my expression. I spoke with robotic, deliberate precision, ensuring the microphone picked up every single syllable. "I have zero knowledge of the document you are referencing," I stated clearly. "I have never seen the commercial lease for your retail space. I never engaged in any verbal discussion regarding funding your business. I never offered you financial support. The signature located on that guarantee is a fraudulent forgery, and I will not pay a single dollar toward your defaulted debt." Harper's tears evaporated instantly. The transformation was startling. The fragile, overwhelmed younger sibling vanished, replaced by a hardened, frustrated adult. Her facial muscles tightened, her jaw clenched. She realized her psychological trap had failed spectacularly. I did not offer an apology. I did not provide an ambiguous statement of comfort. I delivered a rigid legal denial directly into her hidden microphone. She snatched her mobile device off the table, her palm quickly covering the pulsing red light. She shoved the hardware into her designer tote bag. She did not attempt to continue the charade. The mask had slipped entirely, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "You are going to regret this," she snapped, her voice devoid of any previous sorrow. She stood up, kicking her metal chair back so hard the legs scraped loudly against the concrete floor. Several patrons turned their heads to observe the sudden commotion. Harper ignored them. She turned and marched out of the coffee shop, the bell chiming brightly behind her. I remained in my booth. I looked at the table. The iced latte sat untouched, the condensation pooling into a small puddle on the wood. It was a prop left behind on a stage after a failed performance. I opened my laptop and generated a new secure message to Elena. I detailed the ambush, the exact phrasing my sister used, and the presence of the concealed recording device. I explained their desperate attempt to manufacture evidence of a verbal contract. Elena replied 3 minutes later with a brief, validating confirmation. "Her failed espionage mission proves their attorney is nervous," she wrote. "They know the forged signature is weak. They are trying to build a secondary foundation before the preliminary hearings. Prepare yourself." Since the emotional manipulation and the secret recording failed, their legal counsel will now attempt to bully you in a formal setting. I closed the laptop and drank the rest of my black coffee. The caffeine surged through my system. My family had exhausted their covert tactics. They could no longer hide behind Facebook posts or secret microphones. The conflict was moving out of the shadows and into the sterile, unforgiving arena of formal litigation. They were going to demand a face-to-face negotiation, bringing their blustering attorney to force a financial surrender. They expected a terrified underwriter to walk into the room. They were going to meet an opponent holding an invisible, devastating alibi. 14 days before our scheduled appearance in civil court, opposing counsel submitted a formal request for alternative dispute resolution. My father and his attorney wanted a private mediation session. When Elena called to inform me of the scheduling update, she framed the development with her usual clinical precision. She explained that when an adversary initiates a settlement dialogue immediately following a failed intelligence gathering mission, they are broadcasting their vulnerability. They realized the covert recording attempt at the coffee shop yielded zero actionable evidence. Their civil complaint rested entirely on a forged document. The structural integrity of their case was failing, and they needed to extract a financial compromise before a judge examined their paperwork under a microscope. We agreed to meet on neutral territory. Elena secured a windowless arbitration suite located on the 12th floor of a commercial building in the financial district. The room was designed for high-tension corporate divorces and hostile mergers. It featured a long glass table, ergonomic mesh chairs, and pale gray walls devoid of any distracting artwork. The environment was intentionally sterile, engineered to strip emotion from financial negotiations. I arrived 10 minutes early alongside Elena. We took our seats on one side of the long glass table. My attorney arranged a single manila folder in front of her, a prop intended to project organized readiness. We waited in silence. The heavy wooden door opened exactly at the top of the hour. My father walked in first, followed closely by his legal representative. This was my first time observing Greg Pierce in person. He was a suburban litigator who likely spent his career handling minor property disputes and uncontested divorces. He wore a navy blue suit that bunched awkwardly at the shoulders. Before he even spoke, his presence announced itself through a heavy synthetic wave of cheap cologne. The overwhelming scent of artificial citrus and synthetic cedar quickly filled the small, unventilated space, clashing aggressively with the sterile, air-conditioned environment of the arbitration suite. Richard took the seat directly across from me. He wore a crisp button-down shirt and a dark tie. He arranged his posture to project paternal dominance, pulling his chair unnecessarily close to the edge of the glass, planting his forearms on the table. He offered a tight, patronizing smile. He wanted me to feel like a disobedient child summoned to the principal's office. Greg Pierce did not bother with formal introductions. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, leaned back in his chair, and launched directly into his rehearsed monologue. He adopted a tone of practiced condescension, the kind of voice a mediocre salesman uses when attempting to pressure a hesitant buyer. He began by emphasizing the emotional toll of the impending litigation. He suggested that dragging a private domestic conflict into the public judicial system was a tragedy that would permanently damage our familial bonds. He painted a grim picture of the California civil court process, warning me that judges harbor a deep resentment for relatives who waste municipal resources arguing over internal financial disagreements. Then Greg shifted his focus toward my professional vulnerabilities. He spoke slowly, making sure every syllable landed. He reminded me that formal fraud allegations generate a permanent public footprint. He theorized that human resources departments at major financial institutions regularly sweep court registries. He implied that regardless of the final verdict, the mere existence of a high-profile civil trial involving a defaulted commercial lease would render me radioactive in the corporate underwriting sector. He was explicitly threatening my livelihood, wrapping the extortion in the guise of friendly legal advice. Having established the hypothetical destruction of my career, Greg presented their proposed solution. He called it a generous compromise designed to facilitate familial healing. He stated that if I agreed to write a certified check for $150,000, they would immediately withdraw the lawsuit with prejudice. They would absorb the remaining half of the defaulted commercial lease and release me from any future obligations regarding my sister's ruined boutique. I sat perfectly still. I did not react to the number. I utilized my training as a risk assessor to dissect the offer. A plaintiff holding a bulletproof contract does not offer a 50% discount on the principal debt 2 weeks before trial. If my signature on that commercial guarantee was genuine, they would feel zero incentive to negotiate. They would march into the courtroom, present the verified paperwork, and demand the judge enforce the entire $300,000 balance plus legal fees. The sheer magnitude of their proposed discount was a glaring admission of their internal panic. They knew their documentation was defective. They were attempting to salvage half the cash before the entire scheme collapsed under judicial scrutiny. Greg finished his pitch and folded his hands, waiting for my terrified capitulation. Elena Rostova did not consult with me. She did not ask for a private recess to discuss the terms. She simply looked at the opposing attorney with an expression of profound boredom. "That is an interesting narrative," Elena stated, her voice slicing through the heavy scent of the cheap cologne. "However, my client does not finance fiction. We decline your offer." Greg blinked, his confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. He leaned forward, attempting to reclaim his authoritative posture. "Perhaps you misunderstand the severity of the situation, counselor. If we proceed to a formal hearing, your client risks her entire standing in the financial community. We are offering her a very quiet, very affordable exit ramp." Elena tilted her head a fraction of an inch. "We understand the situation perfectly, Mr. Pierce. You are holding a defective instrument and attempting to extract a settlement through professional intimidation. We will not pay $150,000. We will not pay a single cent. You can withdraw the complaint today and walk away, or we can let a judge examine the physical evidence on the record. Those are the only two paths available to you." She did not mention the Delta flight manifests. She did not hint at the Chicago hotel receipts or the time-stamped convention badges. She kept our geographic alibi hidden deep in the dark, denying them the opportunity to invent a new timeline. She simply projected an aura of unshakable confidence. The realization that his bullying tactics were failing spectacularly washed over Greg Pierce. He looked at my father, a silent exchange that signaled his legal strategy had hit a brick wall. Richard could not handle the rejection. Throughout my entire life, my father maintained control through volume and intimidation. When his quiet demands were ignored, he escalated to explosive anger. Sitting in that sterile arbitration suite, stripped of his parental authority and facing a formidable opposing counsel, his carefully constructed facade of the aggrieved victim shattered. He lost his temper. Richard slammed his closed fist against the glass table. The sharp, violent sound reverberated off the windowless walls. He lunged forward, ignoring his attorney's frantic gesture to remain silent. A thick blue vein throbbed visibly against his temple, his face flushing a deep, uneven crimson. "You ungrateful little brat," he snarled, his voice echoing in the confined space. "I put a roof over your head for 18 years. I paid for the food you ate and the clothes on your back. You owe me. You owe this family. You have hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in investment accounts while your sister is drowning. You are going to pay what you owe." His raw entitlement poured out, staining the room. He did not mention the commercial lease. He did not claim I actually signed the guarantee. In his moment of unhinged rage, he revealed his true ledger. He believed my financial success was a communal asset. He felt justified in forging my name because he viewed my independence as an insult to his authority. I looked at the man sitting across from me. I did not feel fear. I did not feel the familiar childhood urge to shrink into my chair and apologize just to lower his volume. I observed him with the cold, clinical detachment of a stranger. I watched the vein throbbing in his temple. I watched the sweat gathering on his forehead. I watched a man realizing for the very first time that his anger no longer dictated my compliance. His volume held no currency here. "Are we finished?" Elena asked, her tone remaining dangerously flat. Greg Pierce hurriedly gathered his legal pad, his face pale. He understood the catastrophic error his client just committed. By losing his temper and demanding money based on parental obligation rather than contractual law, Richard had essentially admitted the lawsuit was a punitive extortion attempt. "We will see you in court," Greg muttered, standing up and practically dragging my father toward the heavy wooden door. We remained seated until the door clicked shut behind them, leaving only the stagnant scent of synthetic cedar in their wake. Elena reached out and placed her hand over her pristine manila folder. A sharp, triumphant gleam illuminated her dark eyes. "They are desperate," she observed quietly. "The intimidation failed. They know they cannot win on the merits of the document, so they tried to break your nerve. Now we know exactly how fragile their foundation really is." I nodded, feeling the residual adrenaline fading from my bloodstream. "What happens next?" Elena stood up and smoothed the front of her tailored suit jacket. Now we move to the discovery phase. They refuse to withdraw the complaint, which means we proceed to preliminary depositions. We are going to place your father, your mother, and your sister in a room with a court reporter. We are going to force them to swear under penalty of perjury to the exact events of October 14th. We will let them weave their fabricated timeline into the official legal record. Once they lock themselves into the lie, the trap snaps shut. The transition from private mediation to formal legal discovery marks a severe shift in any civil dispute. A mediation is an informal negotiation where individuals can posture and bluff without facing immediate statutory consequences. A deposition is an entirely different environment. It is a sworn recorded interrogation. When you raise your right hand and swear an oath to tell the truth in front of a certified court reporter, every subsequent syllable you speak carries the full weight of the law. Lying in a living room is a moral failure. Lying on the official record is perjury. Elena secured a conference room at a neutral reporting agency downtown. The space was devoid of any comforting aesthetics. It featured a long, rectangular table, bright fluorescent lighting, and a digital recording apparatus positioned in the center. The court reporter sat quietly in the corner. She was a focused professional whose fingers rested lightly on the keys of her steno machine, ready to capture and immortalize every breath and utterance. My father was the first individual summoned to the chair. Richard wore the same dark tie from our previous encounter, but his demeanor had shifted. Having survived his temper tantrum during the failed settlement discussion, he seemed to possess a renewed sense of arrogant confidence. He believed the hard part was over. He assumed a deposition was merely an opportunity to tell his version of the story to a captive audience. Greg Pierce sat beside him looking tense and offering occasional whispers of advice. Elena sat directly across the table, her posture straight, holding a single legal pad. I remained seated in the corner observing the proceedings as a silent witness. Elena began with standard preliminary questions establishing his identity and his relationship to the defendant. Richard answered with brisk, annoyed efficiency. Then Elena smoothly transitioned to the core of the dispute. She asked him to recount the specific origin of the commercial lease guarantee. Richard leaned towards the microphone. He wove a detailed fictional narrative designed to portray himself as a desperate patriarch, and me as a willing savior who later reneged on a promise. He stated that Harper's skincare boutique required a guarantor to secure the downtown Sacramento property. He claimed he called me, explained the dire financial circumstances, and secured my verbal agreement to underwrite the venture. Elena did not interrupt. She did not challenge his assertions. She encouraged him to expand his testimony. She asked him to describe the physical execution of the document. Richard painted a vivid scene. He stated that I drove from San Francisco to Sacramento on the afternoon of October 14th. He claimed we met at the suburban real estate office owned by his golf partner, Dennis Walsh. He described the interior of the office, mentioning the leather chairs and the framed maps on the walls. He testified that I sat at the desk, produced my California driver license for identification, and willingly pressed a pen to the signature line. "Are you certain about the date?" Mr. Butler, Elena asked, her voice calm and inquisitive. Memories can blur over the course of a year. Could this meeting have occurred on a weekend or perhaps a different week entirely? Richard shook his head, his expression firm. It was Tuesday, October 14th. I remember it clearly because I had to take a half day off from the dealership to meet Lucy and Harper at the notary office. Elena nodded slowly, writing a single note on her pad. The court reporter's fingers flew across the steno machine, translating his confident lie into permanent keystrokes. Richard smiled, convinced he had just fortified his civil complaint. He had no idea he just locked himself inside a burning building. Susan was called into the room next. My mother has always operated as the silent architect of our household dysfunction. During my youth, she equated maternal love with shielding her youngest child from any tangible consequence, even if it meant sacrificing the well-being of her eldest. She never yelled. She simply enabled the chaos. She took the oath and sat in the designated chair. Her physical tells were immediately apparent. She continuously twisted her gold wedding band around her ring finger. It was a nervous habit she exhibited whenever she was concealing one of Harper's poor report cards from my father decades ago. Now she employed the exact same gesture while committing a felony. Elena guided Susan through the identical timeline. She asked my mother to verify the events of October 14th. Susan recited the rehearsed narrative with practiced precision. She corroborated my father's story, stating she stayed home that afternoon to prepare a celebratory family dinner because she was so grateful for my financial contribution. She claimed I arrived at their house after visiting the notary, ate a meal with them, and discussed the bright future of the skincare boutique. Elena asked her to confirm the specific day of the week. Susan nodded, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Yes, it was a Tuesday. I remember the weather was unseasonably warm. The stenographer captured the statement. Susan had just woven herself into the conspiracy. Harper was the final witness of the day. My sister always possessed a theatrical flair. She utilized tears to escape high school detentions, and she was currently attempting to use them to escape a six-figure commercial debt. She entered the room clutching a tissue, wearing a muted gray blouse designed to make her look fragile. She took the oath and faced Elena. My attorney asked her to describe the atmosphere inside the real estate office on the day the guarantee was signed. Harper leaned into her role. She provided emotional flourishes to the fabricated story. She described my supposed generosity. She claimed I sat across from Dennis Walsh, smiled at her, and signed the paper to help her achieve her entrepreneurial dreams. Then Harper added a fatal, unprompted detail. She described a fake interaction in the parking lot following the notary appointment. Lucy hugged me by my car. Harper testified, dabbing her dry eyes with the tissue. She held me tight and told me she believed in my vision. She promised she would always support the boutique. That is why it hurts so much that she is denying it now. I watched my sister deliver this performance. A profound sense of cold detachment settled over me. I was observing a stranger. The woman in the chair was willing to invent an entire physical interaction, a hug that never happened, to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from my bank account. Elena asked Harper one final question. Ms. Butler, to be crystal clear for the record, you are testifying under oath that you physically saw your sister Lucy sign the commercial lease guarantee in Sacramento on October 14th. Harper looked directly at Elena. Yes, I saw her sign it. The quiet clicking of the steno machine ceased. The deposition concluded. My family stood up, gathered their belongings, and walked out of the conference room. Greg Pierce looked relieved. He believed his clients had performed admirably. They stuck to the script. They provided corroborating testimonies. They painted a consistent, detailed picture of a willing financial guarantor. They left the building feeling victorious, assuming their unified front would force me to surrender before the formal trial commenced. They failed to comprehend the tactical brilliance of Elena's strategy. A lesser attorney would have presented the Delta flight manifest right there in the room, interrupting the lies to demand an immediate dismissal. But revealing the geographic alibi during a deposition allows the opposing counsel an opportunity to pivot. Greg Pierce would have halted the questioning, called for a recess, and instructed his clients to claim they were merely confused about the exact date. He would have filed a motion to amend their civil complaint, altering the timeline to a day I was actually present in the state. By remaining silent, Elena denied them the chance to correct their fatal error. She encouraged their arrogance. She provided them with enough rope to secure their own fate. Richard, Susan, and Harper had just sworn under penalty of perjury to a specific physical narrative tied to a precise calendar date. They testified, they interacted with me, watched me sign a legal document, and shared a meal with me in California on an afternoon when my corporate radio frequency badge was registering my attendance at a symposium in Illinois. They upgraded their crime from simple forgery to coordinated perjury. The snare was officially set, and the trigger was primed. The formal court hearing was scheduled for the following month. We had exhausted the preliminary phases of discovery and negotiation. The battlefield was transitioning from windowless conference rooms to a public judicial chamber. My family believed they were marching toward a guaranteed victory, armed with their rehearsed testimonies and a stamped piece of paper. They were walking blindly toward an evidentiary cliff. The ensuing trial would not be a debate over sibling rivalry or broken promises. It was going to be a swift, brutal execution of their fabricated reality. The morning of the civil trial brought a heavy, overcast sky to the city of Sacramento. I walked through the security metal detectors of the county courthouse alongside Elena Rostova. The municipal building was a brutalist concrete structure devoid of any welcoming warmth. The interior smelled faintly of industrial floor wax and stale coffee. We navigated the echoing corridors and entered Department 4. The courtroom was sterile and imposing. Fluorescent panels hummed continuously overhead, casting a harsh and unforgiving light across the heavy oak benches and the polished central aisle. The municipal air conditioning was set to an uncomfortably low temperature. I pulled my tailored wool blazer tighter across my chest, ensuring my posture remained perfectly rigid. My face was a mask of total calm. We took our seats at the defense table. Across the central aisle, the plaintiffs were already preparing their performance. Richard and Susan sat close together. They deliberately wore muted colors. My father opted for a dark gray suit that hung slightly loose on his frame, while my mother wore a simple navy dress devoid of any jewelry save for her wedding band. They arranged their facial expressions to project deep parental sorrow. They wanted to look like grieving victims forced into an unimaginable tragedy by an ungrateful child. Harper sat 2 rows behind them in the public gallery. She held a crumpled tissue in her right hand, occasionally dabbing her eyes, even though the formal proceedings had not yet commenced. She was treating the courtroom like a theater stage, playing her designated role as the fragile and betrayed younger sibling. A heavy wooden door adjacent to the bench opened. The bailiff instructed the room to rise. Judge Harmon took his elevated seat. He was an older man with sharp, evaluating eyes and a strict demeanor that radiated zero tolerance for frivolous legal delays. He arranged his docket files with precise movements, surveyed the attorneys representing both sides, and signaled for the opening statements to begin. Greg Pierce stood up and buttoned his jacket. He stepped out from behind the plaintiff table and walked toward the center of the room. The sharp squeak of his expensive leather shoes against the polished linoleum floor broke the silence. He paced slowly back and forth, ensuring the rhythmic sound drew the undivided attention of the judge before he uttered a single syllable. He launched into a highly theatrical monologue. Greg did not lead his argument with contractual law or financial statutes. He led with pure emotion. He spoke about the sacred bonds of family obligation. He painted a portrait of a tight-knit suburban household that sacrificed everything to nurture 2 daughters. He introduced Harper as a passionate entrepreneur who poured her soul into a small retail business. Then he pointed a rigid finger toward my side of the room. He described me as a highly successful corporate professional who possessed immense wealth but lacked basic empathy. He told the judge that I had promised to secure my sister's future, only to back out of the business deal out of spite when the commercial landscape became difficult. Listening to his speech, I recognized the distinct echo of my father's internal philosophy. Richard always believed that financial success within the family unit was a shared commodity. When I received my first underwriting bonus years ago, he immediately suggested I use the capital to upgrade his personal vehicle. When I refused his request, he called me selfish. Greg Pierce was taking that exact toxic entitlement and translating it into formal legal arguments. He framed my financial discipline as a character flaw. He suggested that because I had the capacity to pay the $300,000 debt, my refusal to do so was an act of vindictive cruelty. Greg continued his pacing, his shoes squeaking in rhythmic intervals that echoed off the heavy wood paneling. He claimed I willingly traveled from San Francisco to Sacramento, sat in a real estate office, and signed the commercial lease guarantee to help my struggling sister. He alleged that I later decided to abandon the family, leaving my aging parents to face total ruin. He characterized the impending civil trial as a tragic consequence of a daughter's broken promise. It was an incredibly compelling narrative. If I were a stranger observing the proceedings from the back row, I might have felt a twinge of genuine sympathy for the aging couple sitting at the plaintiff table. Greg detailed the exact financial damages. He read the figures aloud, letting the heavy numbers hang in the cold air. $312,000 in defaulted commercial rent, $40,000 in late penalties, $15,000 in associated legal fees. He wanted the judge to understand the staggering magnitude of the supposed betrayal. He emphasized that my parents liquidated their own retirement portfolios to bridge the gap before finally filing the civil complaint. He portrayed their lawsuit as an absolute last resort, a desperate measure taken by broken parents who simply wanted their eldest child to honor a binding legal commitment. But lawsuits are not decided solely on theatrical monologues. They require physical proof. Greg Pierce ceased his pacing. He returned to his table, picked up a clear plastic sleeve containing a single document, and approached the bench. He formally requested to enter Plaintiff Exhibit A into the official court record. Judge Harmon nodded. The clerk accepted the document and stamped it. It was the forged commercial lease guarantee. By submitting that specific piece of paper to the court, the plaintiffs officially crossed the threshold of no return. They were no longer just telling a fictional story in a windowless mediation room. They were asking a judge to enforce a fabricated contract using the power of the state. They were entering a forged instrument into the highest level of the civil justice system. I sat motionless. I watched my family lie to a judge with the exact same ease they used to lie to me for my entire adult life. Richard maintained his somber expression, looking down at his folded hands. Susan continued to twist her gold wedding band, projecting maternal distress. Harper let out a soft and audible sniffle from the gallery. They operated as a synchronized unit. They felt invincible because they believed their collective lie was stronger than my isolated truth. They assumed the sheer weight of their unified testimony would crush any defense I attempted to mount. I did not flinch. I kept my breathing even and measured. In corporate risk management, displaying visible distress during a hostile audit only encourages the opposing party to dig deeper. I applied that principle to my posture. I kept my chin elevated. I did not glare at my father, nor did I attempt to seek eye contact with my sister. I directed my attention entirely to the judge. I studied the deep lines on his face, noting his neutral and analytical expression. He was not swaying toward their emotional pleas. He was waiting for the facts. That neutrality gave me a profound sense of comfort. Elena Rostova sat next to me, functioning as a silent anchor. She did not object during the opening statement. She allowed Greg Pierce to utilize his entire allotted time, letting him build his fragile tower of lies as high as possible. She took sparse notes on her legal pad, her pen gliding across the paper without making a sound. Her restraint was terrifying in its own right. She was acting like a predator waiting patiently in the tall grass, fully aware of the trap hidden just beneath the surface. Greg Pierce concluded his opening remarks. He thanked the court for its time and returned to his seat, looking thoroughly satisfied with his performance. Richard offered his attorney a brief and subtle nod of approval. The trap they spent weeks building was now fully deployed. They had officially tied their financial salvation to a perjured timeline and a fraudulent signature. The burden of proof now shifted to the testimony phase. Judge Harmon turned his gaze toward the plaintiff table and instructed Greg Pierce to call his first witness. The theatrical introduction was over. The formal examination was about to begin, and the spotlight was moving directly toward the gallery, where my sister sat waiting to testify. The bailiff called Harper Butler to the stand. My sister stood up from her seat in the public gallery and walked down the center aisle. She moved with a slow, deliberate hesitation. Her shoulders were hunched forward, projecting an image of deep vulnerability. She climbed the short wooden steps to the witness box, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Greg Pierce approached the podium. His tone shifted from the booming theatrical voice he used during his opening statement to a soft, comforting register. He treated Harper like a fragile glass object that might shatter under the bright fluorescent lights of the courtroom. He began his direct examination by asking her to describe the origins of Lumina. Harper leaned into the microphone. Her voice trembled at the exact right moments. She spoke about her passion for organic skincare and her dream of building a brand from the ground up. Then Greg pivoted the narrative toward the commercial lease. He asked Harper how she secured the downtown retail space despite lacking the required personal credit history. Harper reached for a small paper cup resting on the ledge of the witness box. She took a delicate sip of water, emphasizing her dry throat and emotional distress. She looked at the judge with wide, watery eyes. She stated that I offered to step in and save her business. She claimed I called her on a Sunday evening, told her I believed in her entrepreneurial vision, and promised to sign the necessary financial paperwork. Greg Pierce nodded sympathetically. He asked her to describe the events of the following Tuesday, the day the guarantee was notarized. Harper delivered her lines perfectly. She testified that we all met at a real estate office in a suburban shopping plaza. She described my demeanor as warm and supportive. She repeated the fabricated details she invented during her preliminary deposition, claiming I hugged her in the parking lot and told her I would always protect her. It was a flawless performance designed to manipulate the emotional currents of the room. Greg Pierce concluded his questioning and sat down at the plaintiff table looking incredibly satisfied. Judge Harmon turned his attention to our side of the aisle. He asked if the defense wished to cross-examine the witness. Elena Rostova stood up. She did not bring a legal pad to the podium. She did not carry any documents. She approached the center of the room, empty-handed, her posture perfectly straight. She did not raise her voice or attempt to bully my sister. She understood that attacking a crying woman in front of a judge would generate unwanted sympathy for the opposing side. Instead of attacking Harper's emotions, Elena decided to attack the logistics. "Good morning, Ms. Butler." Elena said, her tone polite but entirely devoid of warmth. "I only have a few brief questions regarding the timeline you just provided to the court." Harper squared her shoulders, bracing herself for a hostile interrogation. She looked confident, believing she knew every angle of the fabricated story. "You testified that your sister Lucy signed the commercial lease guarantee in person," Elena began. "Can you confirm the exact date this meeting occurred?" Harper answered immediately. "It was October 14th. "Are you certain it was the 14th? Elena asked, her voice remaining flat and inquisitive. "Could it have been the 13th, or perhaps the 15th? "No," Harper replied, a hint of defiance creeping into her tone. "It was the 14th. It was a Tuesday. I remember the date specifically because my boutique shipments were delayed that same morning." Elena offered a slow nod. "Excellent. And what time did this gathering take place?" "It was early in the afternoon," Harper stated. "Right around 2:00. Elena took a single step closer to the podium. 2:00 in the afternoon on Tuesday, October 14th. And the location was the real estate office of Dennis Walsh, located in Sacramento. Is that correct?" "Yes," Harper said, her chin lifting slightly. She was overly confident. She believed she was successfully defending her narrative against a high-priced corporate attorney. She failed to realize she was driving her own nails into her coffin. "Did your sister sign the document in front of you?" Elena asked. "Did you watch her physical hand move across the paper?" "Yes, I did," Harper affirmed. Elena smiled, a brief and chilling expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Thank you, Ms. Butler. I have no further questions." Harper looked confused by the brevity of the interaction. She expected a protracted battle, a grueling debate over family dynamics and sibling jealousy. She did not understand why Elena surrendered the floor so easily. She stepped down from the witness box and returned to her seat in the gallery, feeling a false sense of triumph. Greg Pierce stood up and called Richard Butler to the stand. My father walked to the front of the room with heavy, measured steps. He adjusted his dark tie before taking his seat. He projected an aura of weary authority, a man burdened by the unpleasant necessity of suing his own child. Greg guided him through a condensed version of the same narrative. Richard corroborated every single detail Harper provided. He confirmed the date, the time, and the location. He testified that I willingly assumed the financial burden to help the family. When Greg finished his direct examination, Elena returned to the podium. She employed the exact same strategy she used on my sister. She ignored the emotional subtext and focused exclusively on the physical mechanics of the forgery. Mr. Butler, Elena asked, resting her hands on the wooden edges of the podium. You stated that the commercial lease guarantee was notarized by a man named Dennis Walsh. That is correct, Richard replied, his voice deep and resonant. Is Mr. Walsh a personal friend of yours? Elena inquired. Richard shifted slightly in his chair. We are acquaintances. We play golf occasionally. I see, Elena said. It is curious that Mr. Walsh is not present in the courtroom today to verify his own notary stamp. Can you tell the court why the individual who legally authenticated this document is absent from these proceedings? Greg Pierce stood up half out of his chair, preparing to object, but Richard answered before his attorney could intervene. Dennis is a busy real estate broker, Richard stated confidently. He is currently showing properties today. He already submitted his sworn affidavit confirming the signature. We did not feel it was necessary to drag him away from his business. Elena accepted the answer without a fight. She simply nodded and moved to her final series of questions. Mr. Butler, a notary public is legally required to verify the identity of the signatory. Did Mr. Walsh follow this protocol on October 14th? Yes, he did, Richard answered. Did he ask to see a government-issued identification card belonging to your daughter Lucy? Yes, Richard said, leaning forward. He checked her California driver license. And you were in the room when this happened? Elena asked, her voice dropping to a quiet, precise register. You physically saw Lucy hand her driver license to Dennis Walsh at 2:00 in the afternoon on October 14th in Sacramento. I saw it with my own eyes, Richard swore under oath. Thank you, Mr. Butler, Elena said, turning her back to him and walking toward the defense table. No further questions. Richard stepped down from the witness box. As he walked back down the aisle to return to the plaintiff table, he caught the eye of his attorney. Richard exchanged a subtle, victorious nod with Greg Pierce. They were incredibly smug. They believed they had successfully outmaneuvered us through sheer volume. They assumed that because 3 separate individuals provided identical corroborating testimonies, the judge would automatically rule in their favor. In their minds, 3 voices outweighed 1. They thought the trial was essentially over. I sat at the defense table and watched my father take his seat. In corporate auditing, when multiple executives conspire to hide a severe fiscal deficit, they always memorize a shared script. They align their stories. They match their dates and figures. But a shared script contains a fatal structural vulnerability. If an investigator can disprove one central pillar of that script, the entire conspiracy collapses simultaneously. By forcing my sister and my father to repeat the exact same logistical details under oath, Elena did not just allow them to lie. She bound their fates together. They had cemented their perjury before the presiding judge. They established a rigid, unyielding timeline. They locked themselves into a specific room on a specific day at a specific hour. They left themselves 0 room to backtrack, pivot, or claim a simple misunderstanding regarding the calendar. The concrete had poured around their ankles, and they willingly waited for it to dry. Greg Pierce stood up and proudly rested his hands on his hips. Your Honor, the plaintiff rests its case. Judge Harmon made a final notation in his ledger. He looked across the room, his eyes settling on our table. The courtroom fell silent. The air conditioning hummed in the background, a steady mechanical drone. The moment we had spent weeks preparing for had finally arrived. The plaintiffs had exhausted their turn. They had deployed their emotional speeches and their fabricated evidence. The offensive push was over. It was our turn to present a defense. Elena Rostova reached down and picked up the sealed evidence binder resting near my elbow. She did not look at opposing counsel. She did not look at my parents. She kept her eyes focused entirely on the bench, preparing to introduce a reality that would obliterate the fiction they just swore to protect. The geographic alibi was about to see the light of day. The defense calls Lucy Butler to the stand. Elena Rostova spoke the words with a calm, resonant authority that carried across the quiet room. I stood up from the heavy oak chair at the defense table. My legs felt remarkably steady. I did not perform a reluctant shuffle, and I did not hunch my shoulders to project false vulnerability. I walked down the center aisle with the measured, deliberate pace of a professional entering a corporate boardroom. I climbed the short wooden steps to the witness box, placed my right hand on the provided text, and swore an oath to tell the truth. I took my seat and adjusted the microphone. I looked directly at the presiding official. Judge Harmon sat high on his elevated bench, his expression an unreadable mask of judicial neutrality. He held a pen in his right hand, ready to document my testimony. Elena approached the center podium. She did not pace the floor. She did not attempt to charm the room with a theatrical monologue. She carried a single thick stack of sealed evidence binders. She handed the stack to the court clerk, requesting the formal distribution of the materials to the bench and to opposing counsel. The clerk walked over to Judge Harmon and placed the first binder on his desk. She then walked to the plaintiff table and set the second binder in front of Greg Pierce. The physical weight of the evidence produced a distinct heavy thud against the wood. Greg Pierce reached out and broke the tamper evidence seal on his copy. He flipped open the heavy blue cover. He likely expected to find standard civil defense materials, perhaps character references from my firm, or bank statements, proving I never transferred any funds to Lumina. Instead, his eyes fell upon a series of highly technical, authenticated corporate travel logs. In the quiet of the courtroom, a sharp, unmistakable sound cut through the ambient hum of the air conditioning. It was a rapid intake of breath from Greg Pierce. The oxygen rushed into his lungs as his brain processed the first page of the binder. He was a seasoned attorney, and he recognized a fatal vulnerability the moment he saw one. He stopped breathing, his eyes darting frantically across the text. Elena ignored his rising panic. She turned on the digital overhead projector. The large screen behind the witness box illuminated with a bright, harsh light. "Your Honor," Elena began, her voice crisp and echoing off the paneled walls. "The plaintiffs have built their entire complaint upon a single piece of paper. They brought 3 witnesses into this chamber today who swore under penalty of perjury that my client was physically present in a Sacramento real estate office on a very specific date." She pressed a button on her remote control. The forged commercial lease guarantee filled the large projection screen. Elena zoomed in on the bottom right corner, magnifying the blue notary stamp and the handwritten timeline. The letters and numbers stretched across the wall, undeniable and stark. "Ms. Butler," Elena said, turning her attention to me, "can you read the date inscribed next to the notary seal?" I leaned forward toward the microphone. "October 14th. "And did you sign this document on October 14th? She asked. "No, I did not," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "That signature is a fraudulent forgery. I have never met Dennis Walsh. I have never visited his real estate office." Elena pressed another button. The screen transitioned to a new slide. "Your Honor, I direct your attention to Defense Exhibit B located on page 4 of your binder." The image on the screen displayed a pristine, high-resolution scan of my Delta Airlines passenger manifest. The corporate logo sat in the top corner. My full legal name was printed bold and dark across the center, accompanied by an alphanumeric confirmation sequence. "Miss Butler, please identify this document for the court," Elena instructed. "This is my airline boarding pass and flight manifest," I explained. "It details my corporate travel itinerary from last autumn. The departure origin is San Francisco International Airport. The destination is Chicago O'Hare." "And what is the date of departure?" Elena inquired. "October 13th, I stated. The evening prior to the alleged signing of the commercial lease guarantee." Greg Pierce sat frozen at his table. He looked at the printed manifest in his binder, then slowly turned his head to look at my father. Richard wore an expression of deep confusion. My father did not understand the intricate mechanics of corporate auditing. He did not realize that major financial institutions track their employees with rigorous precision. He was a man accustomed to suburban handshakes and informal agreements. He was watching his attorney experience a slow, terrifying realization, but Richard could not grasp the source of the fear. Elena advanced the presentation. A new document illuminated the room. "Defense Exhibit C." "Can you identify this record?" my attorney asked. "This is my itemized hotel folio from the Palmer House Hilton in downtown Chicago," I answered. "It functions as the official billing receipt for my 4-night corporate stay." Elena approached the projection screen and used a laser pointer to highlight a specific line item near the middle of the page. Please read the transaction recorded on the second line. I looked at the projected text. It is a room service charge for a meal delivered to my suite. The transaction was processed on October 14th at exactly 1 in the afternoon Central Standard Time. The silence in the courtroom deepened. The air felt thick, charged with the undeniable gravity of the unfolding revelation. The narrative the plaintiffs had spent months constructing was beginning to unravel thread by thread. But Elena was not finished. A flight manifest and a hotel receipt established my presence in another state, but she wanted to eradicate any lingering shadow of a doubt. She wanted to prove my exact location down to the very minute. She pressed the remote control one final time. The screen flashed, displaying a complex spreadsheet filled with raw data timestamps and digital security codes. Defense Exhibit D. Please explain the nature of this final document, Ms. Butler Elena requested, returning to the podium. This is the official radio frequency identification log from the National Commercial Underwriting Symposium. I explained, keeping my tone educational and detached. Every attendee at the conference is issued a security badge containing a microchip. The convention center utilizes digital scanners at the entrance of every lecture hall. Whenever a professional crosses a threshold, the system records their identity, their location, and the precise time of entry. Elena rested her hands on the wooden edges of the podium. And what does the data row highlighted in yellow indicate? I adjusted my posture, ensuring my voice carried to the farthest corners of the gallery where my sister sat. It indicates that my personal badge was scanned entering a lecture hall on the ground floor of the Chicago Convention Center. The timestamp recorded the entry at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon on October 14th. Elena turned away from the witness box. She faced the bench, looking directly at the presiding judge. She delivered the final, devastating summary with an icy, unyielding clarity. Your Honor, Elena stated plainly, my client could not have signed a document in Sacramento at 2 in the afternoon when she was swiping into a seminar in Chicago, Illinois. The distance between those two physical locations is over 2,000 miles. The courtroom dropped into a suffocating silence. The ambient noises of the municipal building seemed to fade away entirely. The only sound was the faint rhythmic hum of the digital projector cooling fan. At the plaintiff table, the illusion of control shattered. Greg Pierce pushed his chair back, his face drained of all color. He was staring at a career-ending scenario. He had just facilitated the introduction of a forged document into a superior court proceeding. He had guided his clients through a synchronized performance of perjury. His cheap cologne could not mask the sudden, pungent scent of his own terror. Richard sat paralyzed, his jaw slightly open, his eyes darting between the projection screen and his panicked attorney. In the gallery, Harper's theatrical tears evaporated instantly. The tissue fell from her hand, landing softly on the wooden floor. I looked at Judge Harmon. He did not speak right away. He sat perfectly still on his elevated bench. His heavy wooden gavel rested on the polished wood near his right hand, undisturbed and silent. The reality of the fraud settled over the room like a physical weight. The judge looked at the projected attendance log, illuminating the wall. He lowered his gaze to the open evidence binder resting on his desk. He flipped back to the first page, comparing the blue notary stamp to the airline confirmation codes. He traced the dates with his index finger. The arithmetic was irrefutable. The evidence was absolute. Judge Harmon slowly reached up and removed his reading glasses. He folded the frames and placed them carefully next to his gavel. The neutral analytical mask he wore since the beginning of the trial vanished. His eyes hardened, transforming into twin points of cold, focused fury. He turned his head slowly, shifting his intense gaze away from the defense table and directing it entirely toward Richard Butler and Greg Pierce. The civil dispute was effectively over. The reckoning was about to begin. The silence in the courtroom shattered. It did not break with a loud shout or a dramatic objection. It fractured under the weight of Judge Harmon's low, dangerous voice. He leaned forward over his elevated desk, clasping his hands together. He directed his attention entirely to the plaintiff table. Counselor, the judge said. The single word sliced through the chilled air. I require an immediate and thorough explanation for the chronological impossibility currently projected onto my courtroom wall. Greg Pierce stood frozen. The blustering confidence he exhibited during his opening monologue had evaporated entirely. He looked like a man who just stepped off a ledge and was waiting for the ground to arrive. In the legal profession, an attorney possesses a strict ethical obligation to verify the evidence they submit to the tribunal. Presenting a fabricated document knowingly is grounds for immediate disbarment. Your Honor, Greg stammered, his voice cracking. I assure the court I had zero prior knowledge regarding the defendant's travel itinerary. The timeline provided to my office was supplied exclusively by my clients. Greg performed the only maneuver left available to a desperate lawyer facing professional ruin. He physically stepped away from Richard. He moved his chair back, creating a visible, tangible distance between himself and the man who hired him. He severed their alliance in real time. He threw the patriarch to the wolves to save his own state bar license. Richard turned his head sharply, staring at his legal representative with wide, panicked eyes. A frantic, whispered argument erupted between them. The hushed, harsh syllables echoed across the dead, silent room. Richard grabbed the sleeve of the navy blue suit. Greg forcefully yanked his arm away, refusing to make eye contact with the older man. The facade of the unified, aggrieved family dissolved into a pathetic display of self-preservation. Mr. Pierce, Judge Harmon warned, striking his gavel once against the sounding block. The sharp crack operated like a whip. Step away from your client. Greg immediately complied, moving to the far edge of the wooden table. Richard was suddenly left alone in the center of the spotlight. The man who spent his entire life controlling his household through volume and intimidation was rendered entirely mute. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, ghostly hue. He realized his volume held zero currency in this chamber. He could not yell his way out of a perjury charge. Instinctively, Richard turned his body around to seek reinforcements. He looked toward the public gallery, searching for his favored daughter. Harper sat rigidly in the second row. She did not rise to defend him. She did not offer a tearful plea to the bench. She stared fixedly at the scuffed linoleum floor. Her hands gripped the wooden pew in front of her with such intense pressure that her knuckles turned a stark bone white. She recognized the trap had closed. If she opened her mouth now, she would only invite further scrutiny upon her own sworn testimony. She chose the cowardice of silence, abandoning the father who bankrupted himself to fund her retail fantasies. Next to Richard, Susan began to unravel. My mother lacked the psychological fortitude to process the impending disaster. Her breathing turned shallow and rapid. She clutched her chest, hyperventilating as the walls of the courtroom seemed to close in around her. The grand illusion she maintained for decades, the fictional narrative of our perfect suburban family, was burning to ash on the public record. I sat at the defense table and observed the collapse. I felt no urge to offer comfort. I felt no residual filial duty. I simply watched the inevitable consequence of their boundless entitlement. They built a fragile house of cards using stolen identity and corrupted affection. Elena Rostova merely provided the gust of wind. Judge Harmon did not offer sympathy for Susan's distress. He turned his attention back to the forged commercial lease guarantee resting on his desk. This tribunal has examined the authenticated travel manifests presented by the defense. The judge declared, his voice carrying the uncompromising weight of the state. The geographical evidence is irrefutable. It establishes beyond any shadow of a doubt that the defendant was occupying a different time zone during the exact hour this alleged contract was notarized. He picked up the forged document, holding it between his thumb and index finger, as if it were a contaminated specimen. Therefore, the court finds the signature upon this guarantee to be a fraudulent fabrication, he continued. This lawsuit is built upon a foundation of manufactured evidence. Judge Harmon looked directly at my father. Richard Butler, you utilize the civil justice system as a weapon to extort your own child. You conspired to introduce a forged instrument into the official registry. You coordinated with a licensed notary to authenticate a phantom signature. Furthermore, you, your wife, and your youngest daughter took the sacred oath and provided perjured testimony within these walls. The judge set the document down and picked up his pen. "This civil complaint is hereby dismissed with prejudice," he ordered. The words struck the final nail into their coffin. A dismissal with prejudice meant they could never refile the case. Their attempt to steal $300,000 was permanently terminated. But the judge was not finished. The true consequence of their arrogance was yet to be delivered. Bailiff Judge Harmon commanded, gesturing toward the armed officer standing near the side door. "Approach the bench and confiscate Plaintiff Exhibit A. Secure it in an evidence bag." The officer walked forward, taking the forged paper from the clerk. "I am initiating an immediate formal referral to the district attorney." The judge announced, his eyes sweeping across the terrified faces of my relatives. "I am recommending the swift investigation and subsequent prosecution of Richard Butler, Susan Butler, and Harper Butler for the crimes of perjury and conspiracy to commit fraud. Furthermore, I am directing the State Licensing Board to investigate Dennis Walsh for criminal notary fraud." The gavel fell a second time. The sound was deafening, a final punctuation mark, concluding the destruction of my childhood abusers. Court is adjourned. Judge Harmon stood up, his black robes billowing, and exited through the private chamber's door. The ruling was absolute. The civil trial was over, but the criminal nightmare for my family had just begun. Greg Pierce did not linger to console his clients. He hurriedly shoved his legal pads into his leather briefcase, snapped the brass locks shut, and practically sprinted down the center aisle. He left my parents sitting alone at the plaintiff table, abandoned by the advocate they paid to destroy me. Susan buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, ragged sobs. Richard stared blankly at the empty space where his attorney previously stood. He looked broken, a hollow shell of the domineering figure who once dictated my every move. He finally understood the true cost of prioritizing his golden child. Harper stood up from the gallery. She did not walk toward the front to comfort her weeping mother. She did not offer a supporting hand to her devastated father. She turned around, pushed through the heavy wooden exit doors, and fled into the corridor. She abandoned the sinking ship, proving her loyalty only extended as far as their financial utility. Elena Rostova closed her sealed evidence binder. She turned toward me, a quiet satisfaction resting in her dark eyes. "We executed the strategy flawlessly," she noted, her tone calm and professional. "The threat is neutralized. Your assets are secure. Your career is protected." I nodded, standing up from my chair. I smoothed the front of my tailored blazer. I looked across the aisle one last time. I did not feel a triumphant rush of adrenaline. I did not feel the urge to gloat or deliver a parting insult. The clinical detachment I utilized to survive the ordeal remained firmly in place. I realized I was looking at strangers. The biological connection we shared was officially severed by the gavel strike. We walked down the center aisle together. As I passed the plaintiff table, my father slowly raised his head. His eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. He looked lost, waiting for me to offer a lifeline, waiting for the responsible daughter to fix his catastrophic mistake. I did not break my stride. I walked out of the courtroom, leaving them to face the consequences of their own design. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind me, sealing them inside the wreckage. The immediate conflict was resolved, but the quiet, sweeping aftermath of the legal fallout was preparing to reshape our lives permanently. The justice system does not operate with the dramatic speed of a television broadcast. It moves with a slow, methodical grind of paperwork, plea negotiations, and sterile court appearances. 6 months passed since Judge Harmon struck his gavel and dismissed the fraudulent civil complaint. The quiet, devastating aftermath of that afternoon swept through my family like a slow-moving storm, dismantling the artificial lives they had constructed. Dennis Walsh was the first individual to break. The State Licensing Board stripped him of his notary commission within 2 weeks of the judicial referral. Facing formal indictment and the prospect of spending years inside a state penitentiary, his loyalty to his weekend golf partner evaporated instantly. Dennis retained a criminal defense attorney and arranged a meeting with the district attorney. He accepted a plea deal. He turned state witness against my parents, offering a sworn confession. He detailed exactly how my father brought him the forged commercial lease guarantee and offered him a cash bribe to authenticate the phantom signature. Armed with the testimony of their own co-conspirator, the prosecutor filed formal felony indictments. Richard and Susan were arrested on a Tuesday morning. The authorities fingerprinted them, processed their booking photographs, and released them on bail pending trial. They currently face multiple counts of conspiracy perjury and uttering a forged instrument. Their retirement accounts, already depleted from funding, my sister's failed retail venture, were entirely drained to secure criminal defense retainers. Without my stolen financial identity serving as a protective shield, the reality of the commercial default crashed down upon Harper. The downtown Sacramento Property Management Group showed zero mercy. They secured a separate civil judgment against her corporate entity. The landlord seized her remaining inventory, locking the doors of Lumina forever. Harper was forced into Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The court-appointed trustee liquidated every asset tied to her name. The luxury sport utility vehicle she drove since her 18th birthday was repossessed directly from the driveway of her apartment complex. She lost the illusion of the wealthy entrepreneur. I learned through public filings that she currently earns an hourly wage working the register at a chain pharmacy. She spends her shifts scanning cheap cosmetics for the exact same suburban demographic she once viewed herself above. The public smear campaign my parents launched against me experienced a spectacular inversion. When the local Sacramento newspaper published the weekly arrest logs, the truth of their legal situation became undeniable public knowledge. The extended relatives who previously flooded my phone with hostile voicemails and vicious text messages suddenly went silent. Aunt Deborah never called to offer an apology for labeling me a disgrace, but she did orchestrate a swift and brutal social exile. The family network recoiled from the scandal. Richard and Susan became outcasts in their own community, abandoned by the very people they tried to impress with their fictional wealth. They attempted to reach out to me one final time. A beige envelope arrived in my secure mailbox last week. The looping cursive handwriting on the front clearly belonged to Susan. I held the letter in my hand for several seconds. I did not open the flap. I did not wonder if the pages inside contained a genuine apology or another manipulative plea for financial rescue. I retrieved a bold red marker from my desk drawer. I wrote "Return to Sender" in thick, dark letters across the front of the envelope. I dropped it back into the outgoing postal slot, ensuring she would see her unopened words rejected upon delivery. My professional life stabilized. With the formal judicial dismissal decree and the active criminal indictments submitted to the credit bureaus, the fraudulent commercial debt was systematically purged from my history. The severe delinquency alerts vanished. My credit score climbed back to its original peak. The managing partners at my underwriting firm never mentioned the process server again. My reputation remained spotless because I fought to protect it rather than folding to save my family the embarrassment of a scandal. I funneled my protected savings into a tangible, permanent asset. I purchased a 2-bedroom condominium in the Marina district of San Francisco. The property features large windows overlooking the water and hardwood floors that catch the afternoon light. I stood in the foyer on a Friday evening holding a single brass key. I inserted the metal into the door lock and turned my wrist. The heavy, satisfying click of the new deadbolt sliding into place echoed in the empty hallway. It was the sound of total autonomy. This space belongs to me. It is secured by my own labor, financed by my own discipline, and legally registered under my own authentic signature. No one holds a hidden key. No one possesses the leverage to demand entry. I walked into the living room and looked out the glass panes. The fog rolled over the bay, wrapping the Golden Gate Bridge in a soft gray haze. I stood alone in the quiet apartment, feeling a profound sense of peace. Society conditions us to view family loyalty as an unbreakable contract. We are taught to forgive endless transgressions simply because we share a bloodline. We are instructed to set ourselves on fire to keep our relatives warm. But toxic loyalty is not a virtue. It is a weapon utilized by selfish individuals to extract resources they never earned. Taking care of your family means supporting them through genuine hardship. It does not mean allowing them to use your identity as collateral for their own foolish choices. If someone tells you that setting a strict financial boundary makes you a bad daughter, a bad son, or a bad sibling, they are confusing love with compliance. They rely on your silence to sustain their illusions. The moment you demand accountability, the illusion shatters. Breaking that cycle requires walking through the fire of public disapproval. It means sitting in a sterile courtroom and watching the people who raised you face the consequences of their own design. I did not win the lottery. I did not destroy my parents. They destroyed themselves the moment they decided my future was a communal asset available for theft. I merely refused to finance their crimes. I got my name back. I preserved my career. I secured my home. This concludes my story. I know there are people listening to this right now who are looking at their own bank statements, noticing unexplained charges, or feeling the crushing pressure of relatives demanding financial rescues. If my experience resonated with you, drop a comment below and share your own survival strategy. Did you freeze your credit, or are you still navigating the fallout? Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another deep dive into the realities of modern family dynamics. Remember to audit your own circles. Keep your passwords secure and never let anyone borrow your name. There is a deeply ingrained script we are handed the moment we enter this world. In American culture, we idolize the self-made individual, the one who builds a life through sheer grit and quiet endurance. But running parallel to that narrative is an older, heavier mandate: family is everything. Blood is thicker than water. You take care of your own. But what happens when the people who are supposed to be your safety net decide to use you as their parachute? The lesson woven through the fabric of this experience is not simply about financial literacy or the importance of retaining a sharp attorney. It is a harsh illumination of toxic loyalty. We are conditioned to believe that love requires endless sacrifice. When my parents demanded my life savings and forged my signature to cover my sister's catastrophic debts, they did not see themselves as thieves. They saw themselves as parents balancing a ledger that only they had access to. In their minds, my independence was not a testament to my hard work. It was a communal asset, a vault they felt entitled to empty. The most terrifying moment of the entire ordeal was not standing in a cold municipal courtroom or staring at a fabricated legal document. It was the quiet realization that the people who taught me how to walk were willing to shatter my foundation just to give my sister a softer place to land. Setting a boundary against your own flesh and blood feels unnatural at first. It feels like a betrayal. When you finally say no, the guilt rushes in, amplified by the whispers of extended relatives and the suffocating weight of societal expectation. But the truth is, genuine love does not require you to sign away your future. Loyalty does not demand that you finance a lie. The day I walked out of that courthouse, leaving my father to face the consequences of his own perjury, I did not feel victorious. I felt a profound, heavy grief for the family I never actually had. Yet nestled within that grief was the cold, solid reality of my own survival. We rarely talk about this kind of betrayal because it happens behind closed doors, disguised as family favors and temporary loans, but it happens every single day. If you are sitting in your living room right now, staring at an unexplained credit alert, or feeling the crushing pressure of a relative demanding you fix a disaster you did not create, know that you are not alone. There is an entire community of us who have had to learn how to change the locks. If you want to hear more raw, unfiltered accounts of navigating the complex, often painful realities of family dynamics, make sure you subscribe and follow the channel Calm Drama Diary. We share these journeys because shining a light in the dark is the only way to find the exit. I stand in my new apartment today, listening to the foghorns echo across the San Francisco Bay. The floors are mine. The walls are mine. The quiet is mine. But occasionally, when the evening light hits the glass just right, I catch my reflection and see the faint, undeniable outline of my father's jaw or the tilt of my mother's shoulders. We can freeze our credit. We can win our lawsuits. We can change our names and our cities. But as I look out into the gray mist, I cannot help but wonder, when we finally cut the ties that bind us, how much of them do we carry with us into the silence?